assistant professor at the International Relations Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research interests include nuclear proliferation, intelligence studies, and US-Israel relations. Her book, Bargaining on Nuclear Tests, was published in April 2014 by Oxford University Press. In addition to publishing in academic journals, she routinely publishes op-eds and columns in the Washington Post and other outlets. She has a PhD from the War Studies Department of King's College London, an MA degree in security studies, and an LLB degree in law from Tel-Aviv University. What's not on her official bio, but that is relevant for me, is that she also spent some time working at the Israeli embassy in London at the same time, or some of the same time that I was there. So it's very nice for me to be able to see and speak to again an old friend and colleague from those days long ago at the embassy in London. So, Or, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me. And I have to say that, I agree to maintain a certain cloud of ambiguity surrounding our time at the embassy, but people should know that your abilities to imitate an Israeli diplomat with an Israeli accent are quite astonishing. I'm just going to put it out there, and we can continue from there.
Okay, I'm going to maintain professionalism and seriousness, and not reveal any of those talents to our audience this evening. But let's thank you very much for that. Let's start with a question which I think is useful. It's a useful starting point for those of us who don't have your knowledge and experience in covering these issues of nuclear proliferation. Some of us will know that when we hear about nuclear proliferation, we often hear that there's two different ways that countries can attempt to get to the bomb. The plutonium route and the uranium route. Perhaps you could explain that to us in layman's terms.
So thank you for the question, and I've prepared just one slide. It's not going to be a talk with the slide, but I thought it would be important just to underline the differences. So when we talk about a nuclear bomb, we envisage a bomb which uses what we call fissile material, a material that somehow explodes internally, implodes, I should say, implodes internally, and basically gives us that nuclear weapon that we discussed. And there are two possible routes to achieve it, as you mentioned, and we can see it in the photo here. On the right, we see old Iranian centrifuges. This photo is from the early 2000s, picked up from the internet. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the Iranian nuclear reactor in Bushehr. The technologies are quite different. So when we talk about enriching uranium, we talk about locating a mineral that's naturally found in the earth, treating it, or in the Iranian case, basically spinning it in these long aluminum tubes. And at the end of it, we're going to produce a material that is basically found in nature, and we can use it to make a nuclear bomb according to this route. So this would be the enriched uranium, the highly enriched uranium route. Please notice that you do not need a reactor if you take this route. The photo of the reactor, the Bushehr reactor, basically points to a different route. So before I get going, I should mention that the power plant, the nuclear power plant in Bushehr, Iran, was basically the first nuclear power plant in the Middle East. It's been recently joined by a nuclear power plant in the United Arab Emirates, but up until then it was the only one. It started operating in 2010, and it was connected to the Iranian electricity grid circa 2012. This is a nuclear reactor. We don't consider it a proliferation risk because it's properly safeguarded. So that's why you haven't heard a lot about it. Israel's concern mainly have to do with Iran's uranium route. So you can see the two pictures here, and it will kind of give you the very basic impression of how different these two technologies are. In the reactor, we take uranium, we irradiate it, we treat it in a chemical process, and one of the components we can end up with is plutonium. And that plutonium, if we accumulate it and we accumulate enough of it, also we can put in a nuclear warhead and use it for bomb-making purposes. I'm not going to discuss other purposes, and we're not going to talk about civilian nuclear infrastructure in the Middle East. Just one last note, some of you probably follow Israeli news, and some of you probably speak Hebrew. In Israeli news, the confusion is rife. Constantly when Natanz, the Iranian center where the Iranians, it's one of two main centers where they're enriching uranium using centrifuges, it's constantly referred to in the Israeli media as a reactor. Natanz is not a reactor. Natanz is a facility where the Iranians are working on the uranium enrichment route. So we're gonna just keep those two very, very simple explanations. And of course, again, Paul, as you mentioned, these are only the layman explanations. And we all understand that we're not gonna learn nuclear physics in a 2-minute talk in the Begin Center, but just to paint a very broad picture of what we're up against.
Let me ask one more clarification. What are the advantages of each one? Why would a country decide to go for one or the other? Why would they make the decision to go for one route or the other? Is one easier? Is one cheaper?
So you rightfully noted that there are pros and cons in each path. So the uranium path is simpler. You don't need to construct a reactor. You need, and I'm going to simplify it, you need to have to rent out a couple of big basements, right? Build these cascades of centrifuges. They should be working properly and shouldn't be exploding and turning and spinning on their tops, preferably. You need access to natural uranium, which you can process and you can enrich it, and you need to treat it. There are several processes related to this specific process, but it's not very complicated. The United States managed to do it at the end of the Manhattan Project, and then after World War II ended, went on to improve the technology. So we're talking about a technology that's been around starting with the 1940s, but really picked up in the 1970s. Centrifuge technology is not a complicated technology. And there's no reason to think that a country that wants a dedicated uranium enrichment program will for some reason be unable to develop the technology. The bottleneck may be access to technology that it doesn't indigenously have, or maybe access to the uranium itself if it doesn't have uranium deposits within its territory. And you can conceive of other possible hurdles, but we should all understand that this isn't a great technological feat. We're talking about a technology that's been around since the 1940s. And we're talking about a mineral that's vastly around in the Earth's, it's in the water, in the ocean, but also you can find it in the Earth itself. So I'm going to use a quote I found in a document in the Israeli archive, just kind of underline this theme here. In the 1970s, when the Carter administration was just about to take office, this is actually before Carter, the week he was voted in, if I remember the exact date correctly, but really when the Ford administration is in its final days, Prime Minister Rabin meets with a delegation of senators, and one of the things he tells the Americans is the following. He says, listen, and I'm going to simplify it, I'm paraphrasing. You guys, you Americans, you're too preoccupied with the dangers of plutonium. And I'm adding, yes, plutonium proliferation is dangerous. We do not want every country on Earth to have access to plutonium. I just mentioned that it's dangerous and it could potentially be put in a warhead and become a bomb. But what Rabin was telling his American locutors was the following. He told them, listen, while you're basically running around trying to limit the proliferation of technology which could lead countries to accumulate plutonium, centrifuges are being developed and are spreading around. And Rabin was basically talking about other programs that were mushrooming or about to mushroom. And for Israel in the late 1970s, this was a concern, because what Rabin was telling the Americans, and that's the end of the quote, he said, this technology is harder to discover. You don't need he didn't say this, I'm adding, it's a paraphrase. You don't need a reactor, you need a basement with centrifuges. It's going to be much harder to pick up on it, and the technology itself is not complicated. So it should also be on our radars. And if we fast forward from the late 1970s to 2021, we see that to a great degree, Rabin's premonition took shape. Israel is indeed concerned with Iran's centrifuge program.
Okay.
So let's maybe that's for the as for the uranium route. So it's not very expensive. The technology is relatively cheap and it's been around. Now let's talk shortly about the reactor route. So as I mentioned, you want to have plutonium, you need to irradiate natural uranium. There's no way around it. You can't produce plutonium without building a proper reactor, which would actually be, we call it, the field calls it a plutonium production reactor. So you need uranium, you need a reactor, you need a proper nuclear infrastructure, you need nuclear engineers, you need technicians, you need people who are capable of running a reactor. You need to build it. If you're not going to be building it indigenously, you need to find someone who would export it to you. Most countries would opt to buy it there. They're not just going to try to build a reactor completely indigenously. So in the Syrian example, we know that the Syrians bought the reactor from North Korea. And it's much more difficult to conceal a reactor compared to a centrifuge program. That being said, we should give credit to the Syrians. They, to a degree, they got away with it. I mean, it took time until the intelligence picked up the existence of the Syrian reactor. So I wouldn't say it's impossible. And who knows, maybe there are hidden reactors in North Korea. Who's to tell? But the plutonium is more efficient in terms of being used as fissile material for a bomb. You need less plutonium. You need something which amounts to a few kilos and looks like basically either a big orange or maybe a bigger citrus fruit, but it's a smaller amount. It's easier to fit on a warhead, and it makes more sense if you want to use it in terms of in terms of the small amount you're going to need when you want to design your warhead. But again, you can consider both technologies. If we go back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only two events where nuclear weapons were deployed on the battlefield as a part of a war, not just tested, we see that both technologies appeared. So the first one, Hiroshima, was a uranium-based bomb, and the second one, Nagasaki, was a plutonium-based bomb. Now, interestingly, and this is something that I wrote extensively about in my book, the uranium bomb was never tested before it was deployed. And if you think about it in a historical context, it's quite rare, not to say unprecedented, for a weapon to be deployed without ever being tested, not once. Completely new technology, completely new material to the technology, and it was deployed without ever being tested. The one nuclear test which took place in July 1945 in New Mexico was a test of the plutonium device. So the plutonium device was tested. The uranium device, the uranium bomb was not tested, which I find fascinating. So you can see there are pros and cons in each program, and each country that considers taking the proliferation route would likely take its time when it decides on the exact path. We also know that sometimes countries switch paths. So if we consider Osirak, and we're going to talk about it extensively maybe later in our talk, when Israel bombed the Iraqi reactor 40 years ago next month, just outside Baghdad, the thwart reactor called Osirak, or Osirak, depends on how you pronounce it. Iraq switched programs. It switched from contemplating a plutonium-based program into developing a uranium and enriched uranium-based program. Again, we think that this was because it was easier to conceal, easier to carry out underground. No one was willing to export a second reactor to Iraq. The French were not willing. So it basically pushed the Iraqi program underground and into the uranium route. So I'm going to stop here, and Paul, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very useful. Do you want to turn off the screen, and then we'll see. Turn off the screen share. Thanks. So, all right. So let's turn now to Israel's efforts to prevent these various projects from coming to fruition. Now, Osirak's been mentioned, and it's not just, I think, probably the most famous case, but also it's assumed to be the first time that Israel really takes action to prevent this. But I know really only from reading things that you've written that actually Israel was acting against nuclear programs in the Middle East and elsewhere before that. Can you tell us a little bit about this history, including what I think will be some unknown facts for many people?
Hopefully. So let's first contextualize our subject and give some more background. So first of all, I think we can add to our discussion not only operations against nuclear programs, but I think we can expand it to cover Israel's operations against the Egyptian ballistic missile program, starting with the late 50s and going into the early 1960s. And I think we can conceptualize early Israeli thinking on what we call counter-proliferation strikes, strikes against targets that are related to nuclear proliferation. I think we can date it to this operation, the Democracy operation, which the Mossad executed the information was gathered in 1959 and the operations themselves mainly took place in the early 1960s. And here the Israeli concern was that the Egyptian would make progress in developing ballistic missiles which could reach Israel. And the Egyptians enlisted the assistance of German missile engineers, which caused a lot of concern. And I'm sure many people here who are versed in Israeli history, they probably remember a lot about this episode. It has to do with Isser Harel and David Ben Gurion, and we're going to put it aside. That specific operation wasn't as big or as expansive as the operations we're going to talk about next. It saw a letter bombing campaign, which wasn't terrifically successful, mainly aimed the people who were not supposed to open the letter bomb. There was one attempt to assassinate a scientist called Hans Kleinwächter, went horribly wrong. Well, not horribly for Hans, he survived. His jacket took a bullet. But at the end of the day, what happened was that the German government basically paid the scientists to leave Germany and gave them lucrative paths in Germany itself, and it kind of withered away. So I'm going to leave it at that. We're not going to focus on that program in our talk. I'm going to fast forward to the 1970s, and here we see Israel really picking up and rethinking, recalibrating its thoughts about how to prevent or how to act against hostile nuclear programs. And interestingly, and this is something that's not commonly known, there were two programs in the mid-1970s, late 1970s that were of concern to Israel. One, we've already mentioned, is Iraq. But before Iraq, Israel was actually more concerned with the Pakistani nuclear program. Pakistan is still obviously a Muslim state, not a friend of Israel, does not have ties with Israel. In the 1970s, adopted a relatively harsh rhetoric. I have to say it stayed in the rhetoric level. We all know that Israel and Pakistan did not go to war in the 1970s. So quite clearly it wasn't, an all-out war or anything like that. But Israel was still concerned because after the Indians carried out their first nuclear test in May 1974, an event they called Smiling Buddha, the Pakistanis basically said out loud that they're going to pursue the development of the bomb. This was a concern for the Israelis. This was a concern to Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And we can see it in the documents. The Israelis, even before Begin took office, during the Rabin government, we see discussions, Yigal Allon, his foreign minister, discussions he has with the American interlocutors. And interestingly, I found it interesting, he tied the Iraqi and the Pakistani program together. The reason he did this was that the French were the nuclear suppliers. The French acted as the supplying side for both programs. And hence in the Israeli thinking, at least around 76, 77, these two threats were bundled together. And when Allon discusses it, he discusses them together as the French problem, with the French decision to supply technology to both Pakistan and Iraq. So initially, Israel is quite concerned with the Pakistani program. Prime Minister Begin himself goes on to send letters to different European leaders in 1979, asking them to work harder to make sure that companies in the private sectors in their own countries stop exporting and stop cooperating with the Pakistani nuclear program. One of the more famous letters was sent to Margaret Thatcher. Begin raises the concern of Pakistani nuclear technology finding its way to Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi, and strangely enough, this is what happens, but it will happen. We'll find out about it in 2003. Begin basically shines a light into the problem in his letter to Thatcher in 79. But as the Iraqi program picks up pace, the threat perception changes. So Iraq buys the Osirak reactor. There was also a very small second reactor, which was not a source of concern, and hence we don't mention it, called ISIS, but Osirak or Osirak was the main concern for the Israelis. The Iraqis signed contracts to import it from France, and the French were building it. Iraq was a major oil exporter, and Iraqi petrol oils were very lucrative for clients. And bear in mind, we're a few years after the first oil shock, and we're going to approach in 79 the second oil shock in the Middle East. So you can understand, or maybe you can appreciate, why France and the second nuclear supplier, Italy, were quite happy to get cheap Iraqi oil and export all sorts of nuclear-related technology to Iraq. As the program picks pace, and Begin is now the Prime Minister in Israel, the focus shifts. And now Israel, led by Begin, is more concerned with the Iraqi program. And I think intuitively we can all understand why Begin was more concerned with Iraq. Iraq is closer, Saddam Hussein is more menacing. Zia al-Haq, who was the Pakistani general who took over Pakistan in 1977, wasn't a big friend of Israel, but he was quite remote from the Israeli-Palestinian and the Israeli-Arab conflict, and you can't really say the same about Saddam Hussein. One very, very interesting quote, but I should mention it's quoted in Nakdimon's book about the episode, it's not something I found, is the following quote, and I'm going to paraphrase. In September 1980, Begin meets with US Ambassador Sam Lewis. And Sam Lewis asks, this could be August, either in August or September. So in the late summer of 1980, they meet. And Lewis asks him, why are you so concerned with Iraq and not with Pakistan, for example? I mean, both, are Islamic countries or Muslim majority countries pursuing a path to the bomb. And Begin says something very interesting. He tells Sam Lewis, listen, Pakistan doesn't have the platform to reach Israel. Saddam Hussein in Iraq can simply send over a bomber, an old Tupolev bomber, and just drop a device. So this strikes as very sensible, even if you don't know the history. But when you dig deeper, and I hereby invite everyone to reminisce about the 6 Day War, maybe you'll remember that an Iraqi Tupolev bomber executed an incursion into Israeli airspace and dropped bombs on Netanya. So having said that, I think it's easier to understand Begin's concern. In 2021, we're usually wrapped up with our discussion and our discourse about advanced technology and advanced missiles and the range of the missiles and maybe the range of the system that's supposed to intercept the missiles. But actually, nuclear weapons are simple, and you can deliver them in simple methods. If we consider how the bombs were deployed against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's enough to have a clunky old strategic bomber with a clunky nuclear device, and you just drop it and gravity will do the rest. You don't need to have the most sophisticated technology to pose a threat if you can manage to get your bomber anywhere. And it's not only me, or it's not me who has pointed this out. Prime Minister Olmert pointed this out to his American interlocutors when they were discussing the Syrian threat. But I think I'm probably getting ahead of myself. So, cool, back to you.
Okay, so Osirak was 81, and then in 2007, Olmert, who just mentioned, essentially implements the same doctrine when he discovers that Syria is developing its nuclear reactor built by the North Koreans, as you said, and Israel strikes that reactor which was kept quiet for several years until everyone knew it was Israel, but it was kept officially quiet, and then it was formally announced a couple of years ago. Now Iran dominates the conversation when we talk about Israel's enemies today. They have this place in the discourse, which 50 years ago Egypt and the Arab states that Egypt was the lead player in played as the country that has a formal agenda of Israel's destruction and talks in that way. Can you talk to us about the challenge that Iran's nuclear program, what the challenge that it faced, that it poses to Israel, compared to those of Iraq and Syria?
So before we delve into the heart of the problem, I'm going to attack the periphery. So if we consider the ongoing Israeli campaign against Iran's nuclear program, we can see a lot of similarities to the previous campaigns I've discussed. So in the Iraqi campaign and in the Pakistani campaign, Israel was assumed to have conducted a prolonged sabotage campaign to sabotage the program. So for example, in the Iraqi case, in April 1971, Mossad operatives, most likely, Israel never officially admitted that Mossad operatives did it, but this is assumed in the literature. They blew up the core that the French were about to export, the reactor core that the French were about to export to the Iraqis. And they were targeted as alleged targeted assassinations. Again, Israel never officially acknowledged them, but they were connected. They were assumed to have been carried out by the Israelis in the literature. And you see a letter bomb campaign and threatening and threats being sent by mail to certain Europeans who were aligned with the Pakistani export networks in the same time. So some of these components we saw later in the Iranian program. So we're all aware of the ongoing sabotage campaign. So we can think about the Stuxnet malware attack that was revealed in the media circa 2010 or so. We can consider the different explosions which have rocked the Natanz uranium enrichment facility either in July 2020 or a few weeks ago. We can consider the targeted killing of Fakhrizadeh and other Iranian key figures and scientists. So there are a lot of similarities in one aspect, even though I have to say, obviously, we didn't see any cyber attacks in the late 1970s because, hey, who could have thunk it? But in terms of a continuum, there is a continuum. We also see the importance of creating a diplomatic leverage and making sure that the international community is aware of the problem. But again, this materialized in different ways in the different programs. But the Iranian case is much more prolonged. So Israel has been concerned with Iran's nuclear program since early to mid 2000s. And Israel's concern with Iraq was much short-lived. Israel's concern with the Syrian reactor only survived for months before Israel acted. So there are, again, a lot of points of departure to the comparison. Iran, unlike Syria, is situated further away in terms of the geography. Iran has a civilian nuclear infrastructure. It has a working nuclear power plant. We know that Iranian nuclear facilities are widely dispersed, so there are many points of departure in this comparison, as I just mentioned. And the JCPOA and the US withdrawal from it and the international community's response to the entire crisis is again something that's unique to the Iranian context. We didn't see anything like this in the Syrian context or the Iraqi context. And Pakistan, which I can probably situate in the farther end of the spectrum, is a country that was basically, it's a horse that has run away from the stable in the mid-1980s. The international community didn't act quickly enough or swiftly enough, wasn't able to block the Pakistani route to a nuclear bomb. They only officially tested in the late 1990s, but we know that they probably conducted their first nuclear test in the mid-80s. This was, as far as we can assume, hosted in China. So Pakistan, as far as we can tell as researchers, didn't test in a Pakistani facility, but rather, since it was aligned with China, from what we can surmise, it tested a Pakistani device in China, in a Chinese nuclear facility. So it's troubling for us as researchers to say when exactly Pakistan crossed the nuclear threshold. But again, Pakistan is the country that got away with it, and the question is, will Iran also get away with it?
And North Korea.
And North Korea is also a country that got away with this. Yes, yeah. I should have mentioned it. North Korea is a striking example of a country that was adamant in its efforts to develop a nuclear bomb. It took it, it was a very slow development. It's been working on developing its nuclear infrastructure and its nuclear program since the 90s on and off. In the early 2000s, the program picked up. And with the new leader, the third to his line, Kim Jong-un, the program really accelerated, and North Korea managed to become a nuclear capable state and cross the nuclear threshold. But I'm sorry, I apologize, didn't actually answer your question. So Iran poses a threat to Israel due to the larger context. There's a competition in the Middle East for, if not hegemony, let's say for influence. The removal of Saddam Hussein has allowed Iran to become a very influential player in the Middle East. And we see Iran playing in several fields. We see the Iran-Hezbollah nexus. We see Iran's assistance in developing precise missiles, or what we call the Missile Precision Project to our north. We see the involvement of the Houthis. So this is a very, very, very wide scope. The Israeli-Iranian hostilities are basically taking place inside this shadow war, and occasionally we hear of an operation at sea where a container gets hit, and we read in the New York Times about operations in Iran, and it's all out there. The power competition is basically out there, and we don't see, unlike the Israeli-Arab conflict where you see certain paths to a possible resolution. We now have the Abraham Accords in the Iranian context. We don't see the exit way, let's say.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to ask one last question and then turn it over to questions from the audience. So I'm encouraging everyone to write questions into the chat. My question turns us to the United States and the ongoing talks. Indirect talks, I think, at this point, to restart a second version of the JCPOA. Can you? I know that U.S.-Israel relations is also one of your areas of expertise. Can you talk about the way you see it going, both in terms of the likelihood of an imminent return to the JCPOA or a version of the JCPOA, whether it will be significantly different from the first version, and then finally, what Israel's response might be?
So I suspect, and I don't think I'm the only one in this room who suspects it, that the United States will reach a deal with Iran. It seems like this scenario is specifically on the cards. I think that the Biden administration is adamant to renew a deal, probably with some modifications. I don't think a return to the original JCPOA is possible, and you've covered this in your talk with the Halit Bar-El, so we're not going to go into the exact detail and the granular details of this. I think that what the Israeli leadership really needs to do is to very carefully think about how it can create room at the table in the White House and how it can make sure that the Americans are heeding and are hearing Israel in terms of its valid concerns regarding the Iranian nuclear program. to me, as an observer, what's most important in this given scenario is that a dialogue exists and that the Americans are aware of the specifics of Israel's concern. It's not enough to say, we do not want an agreement, hence we're not going to share our thoughts on it. I think that would be wrong. I think that the coming weeks in Israel, politically speaking, would be very influential for any conceivable scenario. And I'm not going to expand on this, we all realize it, that the Prime Minister, if it's Netanyahu or Bennett or Lapid, and whether they actually manage to swear in a government, and even if that government is then toppled, they become a Memshelet Ma'avar. So, you know, there's so many, transitional government. But I think that a lot rides on the question of who's going to lead the government, what kind of relations will exist between a new or an old and existing Israeli government and the Biden administration. I'm convinced that the Biden administration will look positively into creating bridges with either Lapid or Bennett. I'm sure that the administration itself probably prefers Lapid, but they'll work with Bennett. I don't think that Bennett will, get the cold shoulder at the administration. We don't exactly know how things will shape up if Netanyahu will be the prime minister, because there's quite a lot of bad blood between some of the officials in the Biden administration, who are also former Obama administration officials. Colin Kahl, to name one, and there are others we can, and Biden himself, during one of his visits in Israel, had a little rough and tumble. But I'm going to put this aside for the time being. I think that personalities will matter, policies will matter, and the question of whether Israel actually will have a government that's able to put together a consistent, coherent policy will matter, and this remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Well, we've got a bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to go straight to them. Short question, which I think probably requires a relatively short answer. Is Bushehr a fast breeder reactor?
No.
Okay. Not everyone may know what that is, but I don't want to get into it too much now because we have a lot of other questions. There's a couple of questions here from Ziv Rabinowitz, Dr. Ziv Rabinowitz.
Rabinowitz.
Sorry?
Rabinowitz.
What did I say?
Rabinowitz.
No, Rabinowitz. Who's a good friend of the Begin Center and co-author of an excellent book on the Camp David peace talks, which you should all read. He asks, his first question is whether, he says, I'm going to read it out. He says, Israel seems to not rush to force, not rush to use force. Syria was an exception because of the short time from discovery. There are clear technical issues to overcome, but Israel still prefers diplomacy or clandestine operations. What are the considerations in not striking early on?
There are many, I agree with you, Ziv. There are many considerations. First of all, there's the operational consideration. Can you properly hit the target? So it's one thing to hit a single reactor. It's another thing to take out a variety of nuclear facilities in Iran. And we know there are several, and one of them, Fordo, is buried in a mountain. So, you have operational considerations to think of. Also, there's a question of the effectiveness. So technology can be resuscitated, technology can be rebuilt. When you kill a person, the knowledge inside that person's head dies with it, and you need to replace the person. When you take out a technological facility, you can just repair the technology or import it. And I'll give you an example. I've mentioned the reactor core that Mossad operatives had hit in April 1979, as it was sitting in a container waiting to be shipped from France to Iraq. The French took a couple of weeks, fixed the core and shipped it. So if you think that just bombing, or sabotaging a reactor core would derail a nuclear program, it's not going to derail a nuclear program. And hey, it actually takes about 8 weeks to fix it. So you have to consider what kind of a derailment and what's the time frame that you're considering when you're taking out a sabotage operation. And again, a reactor can be rebuilt sometimes, depends on the path that you're taking. Technology can be switched from one path to the other. So there are many considerations just from the operational perspective and the technical perspective. If we put that aside, of course, there's a larger international diplomatic perspective, which we all understand and know. Some operations will be, if not condoned, maybe ignored. Maybe some governments in the US would turn a blind eye to their existence. Some operations would possibly be treated differently because the threat perception or the way that they're conceived and conceptualized would be different. If the world or the international community is completely set against an Israeli attack in Iran and frames it as a horrible act of aggression likely to rekindle an all-out war in the Middle East, it's possible that the reaction would be severe. If countries that Israel hopes would be friendly to it are actually planning on improving ties with Iran, then the reaction would be accordingly harsh. Sometimes these reactions, and I know, Ziv, that you specifically are knowledgeable with regards to Begin and the Osirak attack, sometimes these reactions are not measured properly. So before, when Israel was considering the Osirak strike, many in the Israeli leadership thought that the sanctions and the reaction in the global community and from the US and from the Arab world would be quite harsh. And as it turns out, the reaction in real life materialized to an equivalent slap on the wrist. So the US was supposed to export F-16 jets to Israel. It froze it from June to August, and then it removed the decision to stall the export, and then it stalled them because of the Lebanon war. So, but that was a slap on the wrist. There was also a Security Council resolution passed in June 81. Okay, another resolution. What's interesting specifically about that resolution is there's a few points that are very interesting. First of all, the US signed on to it. It was a part of it. And second of all, that specific resolution calls on Israel to open the Dimona reactor for inspection. So if you're looking at something that in theory could have caused a problem, have a look at the text of that specific Security Council resolution. And Israel was called on to pay remittances to Iraq. But UN Security Council resolutions are not the most important pieces of papers in Israel. So a whole host of considerations, all are relevant, all are important. I think in the Israel-Iranian case, Israel prefers the sabotage operations because they quite naturally offer the biggest dividends with the least amount of friction in the context we discussed.
Okay, thank you. And Ziv, we're going to come to your other question a bit later, I promise. There's a couple of questions about the JCPOA, which I'll put to you together. I think they're related. One is, does the JCPOA prevent or even delay an Iranian bomb? So a question about the actual efficacy of the deal, in your opinion. And the second question is, what do you think is the rationale for the United States wanting to renew the JCPOA? What do you think they're hoping to get from this?
So it's the same question. They're hoping to get the answer to number one. So I'm going to answer number one. So the JCPOA is far from a perfect deal in Israel's eyes. It has pros and it has a lot of cons. First of all, and I know many of you have heard this in Halit Barel's talk, it has sunset clauses. So there are certain sanctions levied against Iran, which are basically limited by time. So, and different areas in the JCPOA are covered by different time frames, but at the end of the day, 15 years after it was signed, assuming it will be in place, the sanctions, the limitations will expire. And Iran will become a legitimate, normal nuclear actor. So that's a big problem for Israel. A second problem, and I think I'm touching here on what Halit said, but a second problem is that Iran's basically been allowed to continue with developing centrifuges and using them. I'm going to put this aside just for the time being. I think that the benefits of the JCPOA outweighed the benefits of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, because Iran is now much closer to being able to break out and develop a bomb than it was before. The limitations and the tools, the monitoring tools that the JCPOA created gave us as observers in the international community a fair amount of accuracy. Not to say that Iran can do things in secret, but the working assumption was that should it violate the JCPOA, we'll know about it because of the different instruments inside the JCPOA. So I think that if you're going to withdraw from the JCPOA, you need to explain what's the alternative. How else are you going to make sure that Iran doesn't accumulate more than 300 kilos of AGU enriched to 3.6%, etc. And I'm not going to quote other stipulations from the JCPOA itself. So again, it was not a perfect agreement. It's still not a perfect agreement, but it's better than the situation we have now when Iran is basically running around doing whatever it wants. So you need to stipulate and be very articulate, or you need to articulate what exactly the alternative is. That's why I think it's important that Israel opens a dialogue and has a good dialogue with the American administration and not just, an overture of a dialogue. I think that the Biden administration also thinks that, and I'm quoting here Jake Sullivan, that it's a good idea to put Iran back in the box, to place these limitations, to make sure that Iran is in compliance. And as we all know, America and the White House and the new president are preoccupied with a lot of other concerns. None of them are the Middle East. With the pandemic raging and with the racial tensions and domestic tensions broiling in the US, and with if you consider relations with Russia and China, I think it's naive to think that the Biden administration will invest any of its capital in reorganizing the Middle East. We're not going to see that. And if you want to take a very expansive approach to what the Middle East is, and you want to include Afghanistan in the Middle East, then you see that they're going to leave bits of it, at least. So I hope I answered these two questions. If I didn't, you can ask me again. I didn't try to evade. I was trying to actually answer them. So the JCPOA is not perfect, but I think in Israeli terms, it's better to have it preferably stronger, better, and longer than just to disengage from the process. Okay,
thank you very much. There's a couple of questions I want to ask about how the wider world views the situation. One is whether Israel's capture of nuclear documents and all the things that Netanyahu displayed in that big press conference, whether that actually, and indeed other things that he's done where he's presented information in UN General Assembly speeches and other things, whether all those things that Israel has done have actually made a difference regarding how the West regards Israel's concerns about this, whether it's moved the West closer to Israel's perspective on this. And the second question is, do the Europeans understand that an agreement will lead to a nuclear escalation in the Middle East? For example, might the Saudis buy a bomb if Iran gets one, develops one?
Okay, so that's a lot of things to unpack. I'm going to try. I'm going to actually start with the Europeans. The Europeans are only remotely concerned with the Iranian nuclear program. That's not to say that they want to see Iran becoming nuclear. Of course they don't. But largely speaking, many of the decision makers and the people in the strategic community, if you talk to them about it, they'll tell you, listen, during the Cold War, we faced countless number of Soviet nuclear missiles targeting different European cities. We learned to live with it. Not to say that it's a perfect thing, but I don't think European decision makers lose sleep at night because Iran may, I don't think they want to see Iran crossing the nuclear threshold, but I don't think you can compare Israeli threat perception to European threat perception and how this issue is framed. That would be a mistake. So I'm going to take that to the second bit, which talks about how the capture of the nuclear archive, the Iranian nuclear archive, change opinion, if it change opinion. So here there are different objectives to keep in mind. So Israel, first of all, proved, operationally speaking, that that it masterminded the game. It managed to pull this glamorous operation, and it uncovered it. And Israel invited people to examine the documents, and they had access to them, and the archive itself was verified. So I think there's a lot of respect, prestige to the Israeli intelligence community and the effort, and no one doubts the achievement, the feat itself. That's one thing. The second thing is what was found inside the documents. The documents show that back in the day, between 1999 and 2003, Iran indeed pursued a nuclear weapons program, and you can read, Ronen Bergman, a journalist, has written about this extensively, had plans of developing 5 nuclear warheads, and you can read more about it. But the documents do not show us what Iran has been up to since 2003 in a positivistic way, meaning that they do not prove that Iran has actively been undermining the JCPOA. So for the Europeans, when you show them evidence like this, they'll tell you, okay, but what you're telling me is basically that Iran has been adhering to this JCPOA agreement, which we think is kind of good. Israel wants to make sure that Iran comes clean. This is called the PMD file, the possible military dimension file of Iran's nuclear activities. Israel wants to make sure that Iran answers and gives direct, clear answers to what exactly it was up to back in the day. And the question is, will the international community press it to do so? And the answer is no. If the international community showed that it's not going to press Iran on this matter, and it's called the PMD file. So the archive had only, let's say, the success was limited in this way. It didn't convince countries that Iran was now actively working on a nuclear weapons program, and hence that they should upgrade their threat perception.
Okay, just one point you didn't quite get to, which was the issue of nuclear escalation in the Middle East, whether the Europeans not concerned that, for example, the Saudis would respond to an Iranian nuclear capability with their own attempts to buy the bomb.
So we know, there are reports, I should qualify what I'm saying. There are reports that there's a Pakistani-Saudi understanding, according to which, should Iran cross the nuclear threshold, Pakistan would reportedly or allegedly supply Saudi Arabia with ready-made nuclear bombs. These are reports flying around in the media, reported by journalists. We cannot verify them. It would be very interesting and very important should we be able to verify them, but we can't. We can suspect them. And even if these understandings do exist, we don't know if when the day comes, the Pakistanis would actually go through with this. So this is just a contextualization note. We don't exactly know what the Europeans are thinking because they're not forthcoming with spelling out what their threat perception is. It doesn't seem that they're too concerned with Saudi Arabia.
Okay, thank you. We're coming up to the hour mark. We have a lot more questions. Or are you good to stay for another 10 minutes or so?
10 minutes.
Okay, Beseda.
But you have to give Ziv Rabinowitz another question.
I promise Ziv, I'm not going to let him down. Before I get to that though, I just want to, in case people do drop off early, I'm putting in the chat the link to Helit Barel's talk from 2 weeks ago, because someone requested that I do that, because I think not everyone on this talk was there for that. So I've just put that in. So you now have the link for that to watch if you wish. Okay, Ziv's second question. There was a debate in Israel re-going nuclear. One reason for concern is that a nuclear Israel would ignite Arab nuclearization efforts, which would put Israel in mortal danger due to size. In retrospect, has this concern proven correct? Israel had to develop a whole system to protect its hegemony, for better and worse. But
I can only answer this in 30 seconds.
Let's give you 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
So I'll unpack the question for those of us who are not a part of the field. So When Ziv talks about nuclear Israel, he refers to Israel's nuclear ambiguity. We should all know that Israel is a nuclear capable country. Israel crossed the nuclear threshold in 1967. It's been extensively written about. You can read it, read the reports in the New York Times and different articles by nuclear historian Avner Cohen, how in the early days leading to the Six-Day War, Israel was contemplating what to do. I should mention these reports have not been corroborated internally by Israeli sources. Israel does not officially acknowledge it, but the fact that Israel doesn't officially acknowledge it doesn't mean that that I, as a researcher, can ignore the fact that it's been widely reported on the cover of the New York Times. When Ziv talks about nuclear Israel, he refers to, I'm assuming he refers to the overt versus ambiguous versus opaque quality of Israel's nuclear posture, what Israel basically signals and tells the world, or whether it officially acknowledges it or not, I think, if I understood the question correctly. So if I understood the question is, did Israel's nuclear program prove to be relevant or valuable to Israel? It's a bit difficult.
Was it? Well, he specifically wants to know whether the concerns that it might ignite an Arab response of nuclearization, whether that actually did whether those concerns ultimately proved to be justified.
It partially ignited it. So I think we can consider Iraq's nuclear program, which we discussed, to be ignited partially by Israel's nuclear posture, but it's impossible for me to say whether Iraq wouldn't have opted to buy the reactor, even if Israel hadn't developed its own nuclear infrastructure. So, but if we read articles about Saddam Hussein and the Saddam Hussein tapes, it stands to reason that Israel's nuclear capabilities were a part of the reason, or one bit of the, if not a very major, actually, piece of motivation. But since so that's one program. I think we can also ascribe the Syrian nuclear program to Israel's nuclear posture. But you can also say that Israel's other capabilities proved able in thwarting or otherwise dealing with this threat. So I think the fact that these two nuclear programs did appear doesn't mean that the entire posture doesn't make sense. So you had this one reactor in the late 1970s, and you had this one reactor in the 2000s, and not a lot in between. So maybe the policy proved that the Arab world is actually quite willing to live with an undisclosed Israeli nuclear arsenal. We also kind of neglected one nuclear program, the Libyan nuclear program. We now know that starting with the late 1990s, Gaddafi, our dearly departed friend, went on a shopping spree buying uranium enrichment centrifuges from the Pakistanis. The Libyans were basically hoarding them. And in 2003, after Gaddafi saw what happened in Iraq, he reached a deal with the UK and the US, and he basically gave them these centrifuges and gave up his nuclear program. This is considered a failure in terms of Israel's ability to pick up the program. The program wasn't picked up by the intelligence community. It's considered, and this is a failure because the intelligence community, one of its mandate, or a big part of its mandate, is to discover nuclear programs in hostile countries. So I think my answer is a bit mixed. It's a mixed bag. I don't think it's a clear cut. Okay. I don't think that, I'll just say that I don't think that for the Arab world, Israel's nuclear program presents the #1 threat or the #1 problem. And I think that there are higher points in the agenda.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Ziv also points out in a subsequent comment, he says, one alternative reason is that these are autocratic regimes who wanted to immunize themselves from the United States and others, regardless of Israel. And actually the Gaddafi point is I think is telling, right? Because Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program and then was subsequently removed from power by Western intervention.
I agree with Ziv.
Gaddafi
did not go nuclear because of Israel.
Right. And then, so you can look at North Korea who say, listen, the reason why we have a nuclear weapon is so that the United States doesn't remove us from power. Saddam Hussein was overthrown not attaining a nuclear weapon, and there is this sort of message that we need a nuclear in order to prevent regime change from over-eager American governments. We need to get nuclear capabilities.
But this, and again, first of all, I agree. If you're going to be a ruthless dictator,
right,
it's a good idea to get the bomb. Just generally speaking, and I'm not convinced. I mean, with the Libyan case, Israel did not. I don't think Israel played a part in the Libyan case. In the Syrian case, I'm convinced Israel's status played a part, and I think the same goes to Iraq. But again, the fact that these were ruthless dictators also plays an important role.
Okay, back to the JCPOA. Two questions that I think are connected, at least in my mind. One is, since the deal lacks any time, anywhere inspections, how do we actually know that Iran was not doing forbidden actions the whole time? And the second question, which I think is related to that, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, how much power does the IAEA have? That is the International Atomic Energy Agency.
So again, the JCPOA is limited. As an Israeli, I would like to see any monitoring capabilities strengthened. The general assumption is that the intelligence capabilities in Israel and the West in general are such that they would be able to pick up a violation in addition to the JCPOA. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we're relying on the JCPOA exclusively when we make this statement. With the IAEA, it's impossible to just, I can't give a black or white answer. The IAEA can be fooled, but also the IAEA can actually be useful in picking up violations. So it's not that I can give a blanket statement which would foresee any future IAEA inspections in Iran. Sometimes people ask me, how do we know that Iran doesn't have a covert uranium enrichment facility in which it already enriched all the uranium it needs for a bomb? I don't know. They haven't told me. We assume we can only use intelligence assessments that are leaked to the international sphere. And from what we gather, we don't think that either Israel or its allies in the West believe that they did so. But if Iran was able enough to take on such an operation and properly hide it from this intelligence apparatus, then it's not impossible. We just currently don't assess the situation as such.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll call it a night or a day, depending where people are. So this is kind of, I guess, to some extent challenging your qualified support for the deal. And it reads like this: shouldn't the collateral damage of returning to the agreement, meaning the pouring in of money to Iran, which will finance terrorism and their missile program, make going back to the agreement a worse alternative? So
what's the viable alternative? You don't have an administration that's willing to contemplate anything else. Israel is not in a position to contemplate. It seems that as of now, Israel isn't willing to do anything beyond the tit-for-tat sabotage operation. So what's the viable alternative? Do you want to see Iran just going from 60 to 90% enrichment? You need to, when we choose when we study strategy as researchers, we study different paths. We compare different paths, and we attempt to understand which would be the path that would serve our interests the best. So to compare the return to the JCPOA and to figure out whether it's better or worse, I need to understand what the suggested alternative is. Do I think that Israel needs to unilaterally strike against all the known Iranian nuclear facilities without the support of the Biden administration? No, I don't think so. Do I think that the Biden administration would support Israel? I don't think so. Do I think that currently this would be the best thing for Israel? I also don't think so. So from the available alternatives, what I mentioned is the best of the available. I don't think the JCPOA is perfect. I don't know if I've stressed this. There are many problems with the JCPOA. I hope some of them will be fixed. I hope that the Biden administration will listen to Israel's concern with an open heart. I don't know if that will be the case. But I can only work with existing alternatives.
Okay. Okay.
The suffocating sanctions didn't work, just so you know. Trump placed sanctions, economy didn't do well, the program went on.
Right, Doug Altabef, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Doug. Doug is asking about the suffocating sanctions. Doug, if you were with us 2 weeks ago, Helit also talked about this quite a lot, about the sanctions and how and why they didn't work. So I recommend you watch that.
I think Doug is pointing to a valid question, to a valid point. Doug saying maybe if we put more sanctions for longer, it will do the trick. But we don't have an administration that's willing to do that.
Right. Okay. I think we've covered a lot, and it's been extremely informative and educational. I think. Thank you very much, Ora, for joining us. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope you've learned a lot as well. I'm just writing in now my email address for those that are not on my mailing list that would like to be, to receive information ahead of time about these Zoom events, upcoming events and speakers. We also have information on the Begin Center website and Facebook page. And I thank you all. I hope you all have a great day and evening. And thank you, Ora, again for all your insights and wisdom.
Thank you, everyone.